At 61, Diane Lane has finally opened up about the man who quietly shaped two defining chapters of her life, Richard Gere. How did a partnership that began on a chaotic film set in the 1980s evolve into one of Hollywood's most quietly enduring connections? And why has she chosen to speak about it now, after decades of silence? Their paths first crossed during the Cotton Club in 1984, a film wrapped in controversy but remembered for the spark between its two leads. Something clicked on that set, something audiences could sense even when the cameras stopped rolling. Nearly 20 years later, fate brought them together again for Unfaithful. What changed between them in those years apart? What did they learn from each other about love, aging, and truth? For the first time, Diane reflects on the journey they shared, how two actors bound by trust and timing left a mark on each other's lives that fame could never define. When Diane Lane walked onto the set of the Cotton Club in 1984, she was just 20 years old, already known for her talent, but still earning her place among Hollywood's most respected names. Richard Gere, 15 years older, was entering the height of his fame. His quiet confidence and grounded energy contrasted sharply with the chaos of Francis Ford Coppola's ambitious production. It was in that environment, demanding, unpredictable, and often tense, that their connection began to form. Diane had grown up under the scrutiny of the spotlight, having worked in film since childhood. She approached every scene with discipline and seriousness beyond her years. Richard, though already a star after American Gigolo and An Officer and a Gentleman, was drawn to her calm intelligence. On set, they found in each other a balance that was rare in Hollywood, a mutual respect that didn't need to be spoken. Crew members later recalled how naturally they fell into rhythm, how they didn't compete for attention, but built their performances around trust. The film itself was troubled. Its budget spiraled, production delays mounted, and the story set against the Harlem jazz scene was almost overshadowed by what was happening behind the camera. Yet through it all, Diane and Richard stayed focused on their craft. For both, the Cotton Club was more than a project. It was a test of patience, professionalism, and endurance. In that pressure, something unspoken took root. Away from the lights, they shared quiet moments between takes. There was no romantic gesture, no grand confession, just conversation about acting, fame, and the search for purpose in an industry that often blurred truth and performance. Richard, already drawn to meditation and Buddhism, spoke often about finding balance. Diane listened, intrigued by his calm detachment from the noise around them. When the film was released, critics praised their chemistry. Even in limited shared scenes, viewers felt something genuine between them, something that couldn't be faked. Yet both actors avoided the spotlight that followed. They gave no interviews hinting at anything beyond friendship. For Diane, the experience marked the beginning of her transition from ingenue to serious actress. For Richard, it revealed a depth in his performances that audiences hadn't seen before. Years later, Diane would describe that period as a learning ground. She had watched Richard handle chaos with quiet grace, and it stayed with her. In an industry where egos often clashed, his steadiness became a model of control she would later emulate. And for Richard, Diane represented something rare, an actress who led with intellect rather than ambition, who could hold her own in scenes without force or flash. Though they went separate ways after filming, the respect between them never faded. When their paths crossed again decades later, it would be that same foundation, the calm understanding born on a troubled set, that allowed them to reconnect effortlessly. Looking back, the Cotton Club was far from a perfect film. But for Diane Lane and Richard Gere, it became something much more meaningful. It was the start of a bond that would survive long after the lights dimmed, the kind built not on romance but on recognition. Two people seeing in each other what few in their world ever truly could. By the early 2000s, both Diane Lane and Richard Gere had lived full lives, professionally and personally. She had matured into one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, known for her emotional honesty on screen. He had evolved into an actor and humanitarian, balancing stardom with spiritual depth. When the script for Unfaithful arrived, it felt like more than a film. It was an opportunity to revisit something they had started nearly 20 years earlier, this time through the lens of experience, heartbreak and age. Adrian Lyne, known for exploring the fragile edges of love and morality, saw what few others could: the unspoken connection between Gere and Lane that time hadn't erased. He knew the story. A marriage torn apart by temptation and consequence would require more than performance, it demanded authenticity. From their first read-through, it was clear that the same unforced rhythm that began on the Cotton Club had returned. Every glance, every silence carried history. The filming of Unfaithful wasn't easy. The subject matter was raw, intimate, and emotionally exhausting. Diane's portrayal of a woman consumed by guilt and desire was so visceral that critics later called it one of the most honest performances of her career. Gere, playing the husband whose calm exterior masks a storm of pain, brought quiet power to every scene. The two didn't need to force chemistry. It was already there, buried beneath years of memory. Crew members noticed how naturally they worked together. Between takes, their conversations were simple, about craft, the weight of the story, and the challenge of showing emotion without words. There was no trace of tension, only mutual trust. That trust allowed them to explore some of the film's most difficult scenes with depth and restraint. When Unfaithful premiered in 2002, audiences were captivated. The film was provocative, but beneath its controversy lay something deeper, a portrayal of two people bound by love and destruction, portrayed by two actors who understood those emotions instinctively. Diane's performance earned her an Academy Award nomination, while Gere's understated strength reminded audiences of his emotional range. For both, the film marked a turning point. It redefined how they were perceived. Not as glamorous icons, but as artists capable of profound truth. In later interviews, Diane would admit that Unfaithful required more vulnerability than any role before it. She described it as emotionally dangerous, a performance that drew from real-life understanding rather than technique. Gere, when asked about their chemistry, simply said, "We trusted each other completely." Their reunion reignited public curiosity. Were they ever more than co-stars? Did the intensity on screen reflect something real? Neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, they let silence do what words couldn't. For fans, that silence became its own answer. Years after the film's release, critics still cite Unfaithful as one of the most emotionally authentic portrayals of marriage ever captured on screen. But for Diane Lane and Richard Gere, it was something more personal, a chance to revisit an unfinished story from their past, to express through art what life had never allowed them to say aloud. When filming wrapped, there was no dramatic farewell, just quiet respect, and the sense that they had once again helped each other reach something rare in their craft: truth. After Unfaithful, the public fascination with Diane Lane and Richard Gere only deepened. Their on-screen connection had been undeniable, but off-screen what lingered between them was quieter, an enduring bond built not on romance, but on shared understanding. They had entered each other's lives at pivotal moments, both times when they were evolving, questioning and redefining what mattered most. Neither sought to capitalize on the attention that followed. They rarely appeared together publicly and avoided feeding the speculation that had followed them for decades. Instead, they stayed in touch in subtle ways: occasional phone calls, shared notes of support, and kind words during interviews that spoke volumes without revealing details. What they had was rare in their industry: trust. For Diane, that trust became a touchstone in her career. She often spoke about how acting, when done truthfully, required surrender, allowing oneself to be seen without defense. Working with Richard, she said, made that surrender possible. She could let go of control, knowing he would meet her halfway. For Gere, the connection was equally significant. He once reflected on how difficult it was to find genuine partnership on set, the kind that feels safe yet unpredictable. With Diane, that balance came naturally. Behind the scenes, both faced challenges that mirrored the emotional depth of their films. Diane's marriage to Josh Brolin ended in the years following Unfaithful, a period she later described as one of personal rebuilding. Gere, too, experienced change. His commitment to humanitarian causes deepened, and his focus shifted away from Hollywood's demands. Through those transitions, their mutual respect never wavered. It was less about staying close in proximity and more about remaining connected in spirit. In interviews, when asked about each other, their answers were always marked by warmth and restraint. Gere would often credit Diane with bringing grace and intelligence to every role. Diane, in turn, described him as a rare kind of actor, someone who listened more than he spoke, who gave his scene partners space to shine. The admiration was unmistakable. Over time, that bond evolved into something even more meaningful: quiet gratitude. Both had reached stages in their lives where the chase for fame had faded, replaced by reflection. They had seen how fragile relationships in Hollywood could be, how easily they were consumed by publicity and ego. Yet their connection endured precisely because it existed outside of that world. There were no public reunions, no nostalgic collaborations designed to reignite what once was. Their story continued in absence, in the way they carried each other's influence forward. Directors who worked with Diane noticed her grounded calm. Those who worked with Gere remarked on his depth and stillness. Each had in some way absorbed qualities from the other. For Diane, that influence revealed itself in later performances marked by quiet power and emotional control. For Richard, it appeared in his shift toward more introspective roles, films that valued truth over spectacle. Though their lives diverged, the imprint of what they shared remained. When asked years later whether she would work with Gere again, Diane smiled and said, "If the story was right, there was no hesitation, no nostalgia, just certainty." It was the kind of answer that said more than a confession ever could. In a business defined by temporary partnerships, theirs endured. It didn't need labels or constant presence to exist. It lived in memory, in trust, and in the shared belief that what they created together mattered and always would. As the years passed, both Diane Lane and Richard Gere moved deeper into separate lives shaped by time, family, and perspective. Hollywood continued to link their names, but their realities were far quieter. Gere's world became defined by his humanitarian work, Buddhist faith, and the pursuit of privacy that fame had long denied him. Diane's focus turned inward, toward her daughter, her craft, and the steady work of sustaining a long career without surrendering to spectacle. By the mid-2000s, their paths no longer crossed, yet traces of their connection lingered in subtle ways. When Gere accepted humanitarian awards, he spoke about empathy as an actor's greatest tool, the same sensitivity that Diane had once admired. When Diane was asked about aging in the industry, she spoke about grace, gratitude, and finding purpose beyond the spotlight, values Gere had embodied long before they became fashionable. Though years apart, their philosophies began to mirror each other. The distance between them wasn't born of conflict, but of circumstance. Hollywood has never been kind to longevity, and schedules, continents, and private lives pulled them in opposite directions. Still, the affection remained visible to anyone paying attention. When Gere's films such as Arbitrage and Nights in Rodin, they revisited themes of regret and redemption, Diane publicly praised his work. When Diane appeared in roles that demanded emotional precision, Gere described her performances as truthful and fearless. In another time, perhaps their connection might have become something more, yet both seemed to understand that some relationships are meant to remain undefined. There was mutual respect in the distance, an unspoken promise to never let the past distort what they once shared. Friends close to them described a steady regard that endured quietly across decades, built not on nostalgia, but on genuine care. Diane's later interviews revealed a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had shaped her professionally. When she mentioned Richard Gere, it was never in romantic terms, but with the kind of warmth reserved for those who leave a lasting mark. She credited him with teaching her stillness, how to express more with silence than dialogue, how to trust what wasn't said. Gere, in turn, often spoke about connection in his Buddhist teachings, emphasizing compassion and the rarity of meeting someone who reflects your inner world. They had both learned that fame, for all its rewards, also isolates. But in the small window where their paths aligned, they found an authenticity few experience in that industry. It wasn't the intensity of a love story, but the gentleness of recognition, two people seeing each other clearly amid a world that thrives on illusion. Over time, the questions from fans, did they ever fall in love, faded into something quieter. Why does their connection still feel real? The answer perhaps lies in the simple truth that what they shared was never built for the tabloids. It existed in shared glances, mutual growth, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest relationships are those that never need to be named. Years later, when asked what she remembered most about working with Gere, Diane smiled and said, "It felt easy." That word easy captured everything. No drama, no distance, no loss. Just two lives that crossed at the right moments, long enough to leave behind something that time couldn't erase. By the time Diane Lane reached her 60s, her perspective on fame, work, and love had changed completely. She had lived through the noise of celebrity, the solitude that follows it, and the grace that comes with distance. When she finally spoke about Richard Gere, her words carried no regret, only calm recognition of what their connection had meant. It wasn't about lost opportunity. It was about gratitude for something that had quietly endured for nearly 40 years. She described him as one of the few people in Hollywood who truly understood her rhythm. Their friendship, she explained, had been built on honesty and shared respect for the craft. Both valued truth over performance. Both guarded their private lives carefully. In an industry that thrives on spectacle, that restraint was its own act of devotion. When journalists tried to frame their relationship as unfinished romance, Diane always redirected the conversation toward what really mattered, the human bond behind the performances. She credited Richard with shaping the way she approached vulnerability on screen. He, in turn, once said that she possessed a depth that never needed to be performed. Their mutual influence became clear in the years that followed. Each continued to choose projects rooted in emotional authenticity rather than fame or formula. In Diane's later work, Under the Tuscan Sun, Let Him Go, a little romance revisited in reflection, there was a patience, a stillness that mirrored the lessons she had absorbed from people like Gere. And in his own films, from the second-best exotic Marigold Hotel to Norman, his characters carried a humility that reflected a lifetime of introspection. They had, in their separate paths, come to embody the same message that love doesn't always arrive in the form people expect. Sometimes it appears as understanding, sometimes it lasts as memory. When asked if she ever imagined reuniting with Richard Gere for another film, Diane didn't hesitate. If the story asked for it, she said, "We'd find each other again." It was simple, without embellishment. For those who had followed their journey since the Cotton Club, that single line felt like closure, not an ending but acknowledgement. In many ways, their story became a reflection of real life, the kind where connection doesn't need to be dramatic to matter. They were never defined by scandal or speculation. Instead, they showed what it means to meet someone at the right time, let them leave an imprint, and carry that quiet mark through the years. Richard Gere once said that certain people enter your life to hold up a mirror, revealing who you are and what you still need to learn. For Diane, that mirror had been him. For him, it had been her. Neither could have predicted how deeply their paths would intertwine or how gracefully they would drift apart. Yet even in distance, there was peace, a recognition that some relationships endure without being constant. Decades after that first meeting in 1984, their names still appear side by side, whispered by audiences who sensed something real behind the stories they told. And perhaps that is the truth. Diane finally chose to share that what they created together wasn't just film history. It was a reminder that love in its quietest form can last a lifetime. Diane Lane's story with Richard Gere has never needed labels, because its meaning was never about definition. It was about timing, about meeting someone who reflected her ambition, her gentleness, and her belief that truth in art comes from truth in life. From the Cotton Club to Unfaithful, they shared a connection that survived every change around them. It wasn't a romance that faded or a friendship that required distance. It was something steadier, mutual respect that grew deeper with age. Today, when Diane speaks about him, her tone carries quiet gratitude. She remembers his calm when everything else felt loud, his steadiness when fame felt uncertain. And though decades have passed, that gratitude remains. Their story reminds us that not every bond must end with resolution. Some simply endure, quietly shaping who we become. For Diane Lane and Richard Gere, that's the truth she finally chose to tell. The truth of connection that outlasted youth, distance, and time itself. For more emotional stories, check out this video.